Today I'm going to talk to you about knights, crusades, and medieval wealth, but not in the way you expect. Men swinging swords, crusader banners, castles, those were just the visible surface hour. The truly interesting question is this. Long before modern banks, Swiss accounts, and offshore havens existed, who was storing money, who was moving it, and who was protecting whose wealth? And an even more provocative question. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, a knightly order sitting on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean was acting like a semi-sovereign offshore bank, storing the money of kings and merchants, transferring funds across continents, and operating tax-exempt? The story I'll tell today is the story of the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of the Hospital, and how, thanks to their stable income network, international branches, and political protections, they became one of history's earliest examples of offshore. It all began with a small hospital in Jerusalem. In the century, this hospital was founded for Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, and over time it turned into the Order of St. John, and from there into the Knights Hospitaller. When they were officially recognized by the Pope in 1113, they were not just a charitable religious group, they also gained a special status. They could own land and property all across Europe. They could channel these revenues directly to their central headquarters. They were exempt from many local taxes and feudal obligations. What does that mean? A vast network stretching from France to Spain, from Italy to Germany, with commanderies as branches, constantly channeling money through rents, produce taxes, donations, and bequests. Even after Jerusalem fell, this network did not disappear. The order moved first to Acre, then to Cyprus, then to Rhodes, and finally to Malta. But wherever they went, one thing stayed constant. The income from hundreds of estates in Europe continued to flow regularly to their centers in the Mediterranean. In other words, even in the 13th to 14th centuries, the Hospitallers had already built a multinational, tax-advantaged cross-border income machine. When the Crusader states collapsed in 1291, for the Templar Knights this was the beginning of the end, but for the Hospitallers, a new era opened. Around 1310, they seized Rhodes and founded their own monastic state there. They were no longer just a religious military order. They had become a political economic actor with its own currency, its own ports, its own custom system. Here's what they did in Rhodes and later in Malta. They created a central treasury that collected revenues from the European commanderies. They established a clear internal system of money and silver gold. They became a choke point, right in the middle of one of the most important trade routes in the Mediterranean, monitoring both trade and the flow of money. Across Europe, knightly houses, monasteries, and manors sent a fixed amount of revenue in goods each year: land rents, shares taken from harvests, tithes, bequests, and donations from wealthy nobles. These revenues were collected in the central treasury in Rhodes and Malta, and from there redistributed to fund the navy, fortress construction, soldiers' pay, and diplomatic missions. What emerged? A financial structure across the entire order that looked very much like what we'd call a balance sheet today. Revenues in Europe, expenditures in the Mediterranean, and money constantly moving in both directions. So why did this structure function like an offshore bank? There are a few critical points. Partial exemption from taxes and local law. The order was directly subject to the papacy. It stood outside many royal tax systems, so when a French or Spanish noble donated or entrusted part of his wealth to the Hospitallers, that money was partly protected from local taxation and confiscation, secure deposit, and custody function. In the Middle Ages, travel was dangerous. Robbery, pirates, war, pilgrims, merchants, and even minor principalities could avoid physically transporting money by depositing it at one Hospitaller branch, and then receiving the equivalent at another commandery or at Rhodes/Malta. This strongly resembled an early form of remittance/transfer political safe haven effect. If a ruler saw civil war or a succession struggle looming in his own country, he could place part of his fortune under the order's protection. Because the Hospitallers were not tied to a single king, they were an international religious military structure. So the money was removed from the risk of confiscation by any one state. Limited transparency, controlled access. The order's accounts were subject to internal regulations and oversight by the Grand Master and the Council, but for an ordinary king or local ruler, this world was effectively a black box. From the outside, there was a treasury in Rhodes, Malta, but not everyone could see the details. Now think about what we call offshore centers today: a small island, local tax advantages, international capital flowing in and out, and a financial structure that is partially opaque. The Hospitaller system in Rhodes and Malta fits this picture remarkably well. In 1307, when the Templar knights were arrested in France and their order was dissolved, the balance of financial power in Europe was shaken. Many Templar properties, over time, passed into the hands of the Hospitallers. This did two things at once. It broadened the income base of the order, and at the same time it made them much more visible and more of a target in European politics. When the Reformation erupted in the century, Hospitaller properties in many Protestant regions were nationalized or broken up. As income from Northern Europe weakened, the order found itself squeezed into Malta in the Mediterranean. Despite this, the system in Malta continued to function. The island was a forward outpost against the Ottomans. It was also a naval base monitoring Mediterranean trade, and it still served as a center absorbing revenues from the remaining commanderies in Europe. At this point, the Hospitallers kept their financial model alive through rents and taxes coming from Europe, prize shares from privateering and corsair campaigns, port and customs revenues, and a secure deposit and custody role for some princes and wealthy families. In other words, a multi-stream income model operated, military, commercial, and financial at once. Now let's leave the 14th to 16th centuries and jump to the present. What do we talk about today in the world of finance? Tax havens, offshore centers, tiny island states managing massive flows of capital, multinational corporations using legal loopholes to minimize taxation across different countries. As one of the earliest examples of this whole picture, we can look at the Hospitaller system in Rhodes and Malta. Of course, it's not identical, one-to-one. In the Middle Ages, balance sheets weren't kept in Excel. There were no SWIFT messages, no Basel rules. But the logic is familiar. A politically semi-autonomous structure, tax-advantaged income streams coming from multiple countries, a safe haven for elites who want to protect their wealth, a special status financial sphere operating outside classic state oversight. In short, some of the mechanisms we debate today as modern financial innovation were tested centuries ago by these knights, who carried swords but also lived by their account books. We can draw at least three clear lessons from this story. 1. If you hide where money flows, power accumulates there. The Hospitallers' power came not only from their fortresses, but from an income network that no one could fully trace today. 2. Complex tax structures, offshore centers, and shadow funds can shift political power to places very different from where we think it resides. 2. Finance independent of the state protects at first, then becomes a rival. At the beginning, this knightly banking system was a useful ally for kings, but over time it turned into a semi-independent power, with its own laws, its own army, its own agenda. Today, financial giants moving above nation-states raise very similar questions again. 3 institutions that look small can have massive impact on global money flows. On the map, Rhodes and Malta look tiny, but they became critical crossroads for Europe's trade, tax avoidance, and wealth storage. When we think of Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, or other island centers today, the rhythm of history doesn't feel so different. In today's world, we also have to ask, do we really know where wealth is being held? Which institutions are hiding and steering the money? And maybe the Hospitaller story reminds us of this. Swords may have been replaced by computers, but the question of who holds the money and who gains power while that money is being held hasn't changed much in centuries. And let's close with your channel's usual line. If what I've shared today helped you see the world from a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe. Because history always has an answer, you just need to look from the right angle, and I'm here to help you find those answers buried in the dusty pages of financial history.